Okay, welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. We decided to make these webinars because we're 20 years old now. ABR.
Well, and it's an extended version, right? So it depends on how we take it, right? So it could be 21, it could be 19, it could be 20, depending on where you place it. So let's kind of call it the extended preparations, right? So the extended preparation, depending on when we mark the date. Yeah. So.
Right. So in that respect, Leonid and I come from two completely different backgrounds. He's a mathematician and a physicist. I come from more, well, that's your background.
Yeah, but cybernetics is not physics, so just.
All right, we used to call it physics. Now you call it cybernetics.
Okay.
Never mind. You come from a more mathematical background.
That's true.
I come from a less mathematical background. I come much more from the side of child development and, as he's saying, the humanistic approach, the approach to children, the approach to how children develop by Rudolf Steiner, Emmy Pichler, Elfriede Hengstenberg, and completely, let's say, and in the last 100 years or in the early part of the last century, where they developed a completely different way of observing children than had been there before. So we met in this situation of me having a child who needed help. And I could see that ABR offered really a lot to this whole question of children with special needs and how to approach them. So one of the things we'll look at tonight is this kind of humanistic approach. But on the way, we've kind of found out that structural development, or let's say structural ripening with children and their development goes hand in hand when they're very small. When they're infants, their structure changes with their development. It's all kind of in one picture. So that's something that kind of window in the first year or maybe 2 years, that sort of slowly closes down for anybody. And when we're adults, development and structural ripening doesn't have much to do with each other anymore. So we're quite different individuals than we are when we're children. So that's kind of the thing we might say could be kind of a big picture to look at. What is development? What is child development? What is neurology? Because in effect, child development is still very much ruled by this whole, or not ruled, but the background picture is neurology, neurological development. But if you look at the child from the point of view of observation, which is what interests me so much in Leonid's approach from the very beginning, was that actually one looks at the child. And therefore the humanistic approach, or this approach that Emmy Pichler and Rudolf Steiner developed, as well as Hengstenberg and other more or less German, Hungarian individuals, was really observing the children. So that's what I was really drawn to here with ABR. And we're going to kind of look at how these things come together. Did I say?
Yeah, I think it's a good line, right? But probably it makes sense for us to sort of establish a little bit bigger context, right? Because, well, obviously it just happened that despite your American upbringing, so you kind of made a backflip in the air, right? So you see that like 40 years ago, right? And got very much involved into the German tradition, right? So, and this is one of the things that we probably have to sort of get going, because what we are seeing today as the prevalent tradition in child rearing, in prevalent sort of perspective in child rearing, is the perspective which has been more or less established, say, starting from the 1950s in the US, with all this focus on the psychology and function, achievement, and kind of being driven very much with the idea of the idea of the success and the idea of some achievements and so on. So, and in that sense, your background with the interest in the other schools of thought, which came much earlier than that, right? So the schools of thought particularly the German speaking and the, like the Austro-Hungarian thing, so which were more prevalent in the beginning of the last century. So I think that that's also a very interesting source of perspectives, because we really, I believe, see today the limitations of that kind of, psychology mixed with management and productivity type of approach to childhood that very much has been prevalent in the entire child rearing, right? And if you look at things like Doman approach and so on, so those would be really the ultimate versions of this, right? So you take the child, you design certain outcome functions, and you start really doing the intense training towards those functions, like overcoming all sorts of the obstacles. So this perspective of the humanistic take, and really being, maybe 2 steps behind, and creating the environment which really fosters the child innate creativity and their own ability to explore and discover. So this is what I believe is really missing today, and particularly missing in the entire field of rehabilitation. And at the same time, what I believe Diane very much brings to the table with her genuine interest into this field, right, and the ability to read the first-hand things in, like Steiner and the others, so the German text. So, and I think that that is really a valid perspective today, like beyond the discussion of the 20 years of ABR, but we can talk about 100+ years of this humanistic tradition in child rearing. And very much this series of webinars is the idea of how we can link it, and how we can try to find the ways and perspectives which are going to facilitate the development of a child in the in the home environment, right? So you see what could be done, how the environment could be organized in such a way, so, and what things to look at, so that we can really get more like of that fertilizing, flourishing fertilizing environment for the child, for the child's flourishing. So that's probably the angle that I would add to this introduction. Diane?
Okay, so if we
so maybe what I'm suggesting is that, since we kind of already started this German tradition, and since it's been kind of like locked behind the the veil of the language barrier, maybe it makes sense for us to maybe even venture a little bit more in this direction, and for you to give some like intro into how you see more specifically this tradition of child rearing and the child observation and paying attention, because even Feldenkrais to a certain extent would actually fall into this type of tradition, right? So, and yeah, and then we'll see where we can take it from there, right? So we don't have the ambition of squeezing everything in today's webinar, right? So you see, that's the whole idea, is to really start the conversation and elaborate on that, since we don't have that much time to talk about those things during the practical sessions with the families.
Well, it's quite right what you said, that Feldenkrais falls into this tradition, because he, if anyone knows the story, what I understand about him, his wife was a child practitioner as well. So he had all these babies in front of him all the time. So it's really based on the observation of babies and how they learn things. And this is similar to Pickler's approach. She was a child pediatrician, and she saw the small babies in front of her all the time on the floors when the parents brought them in. And she realized that these small individuals were so far away from the parents' own behavior. Their parents behaved in one way and the babies behaved in another way. And she began to observe what they actually did and how they gave signals from themselves and how they actually could communicate already in the very first moments of life. So she became quite focused on this way of the child's entire integrity in the first moments. And this is something that the American approach completely kind of rides over. And if any of you have had your children in the hospitals, you'll hear things like this, like the small babies, oh, they don't notice anything. Small babies don't notice anything. A lot of doctors said this to us. And I've heard other parents say that they're always saying, oh, they don't notice it. You know, you give them shots, you put them in the sun, you put them under lights, you traumatize them maybe the whole entire day of the first 10 days of life. If they're in the hospital, many of our children have been in the hospital in the first 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks of life. They keep saying they don't notice anything. So they also are kind of treating the children like this. They pick them up, they wake them up in the night, they do things in a way that they're not being taken into respect. And Amy Pickler was saying from the first moment, you have to respect this child because the child is so engaged as a sensory organism. It senses everything. The child sees everything, smells you. Even if the eyes are closed, this child knows exactly what you're doing. So she developed this entire approach of how to handle a child, not handling like a handler, but how to even, you know, introduce yourself. Hi.
Well, actually, that's maybe if I just
Go ahead.
No, I just want to put a highlight there, right? So you see what you just pointed out, right? So you see that the first starting point of everything being the respect for the child. So that is a really good point. And you see, to a great extent, you know, like what I feel here is that you know, when we talk about it, you know, the respect, right? So I think that it really deserves a further elaboration, right? Because we kind of come from different ways of looking at that respect. And my own way of looking at it was probably very cybernetic, right? In a way that I would really see not so much a small child, right? But I would see a very complex system which we have very limited access to, right? And in that sense, once we see a very complex system which we have very limited access to, which is like a giant, you know, a small child, a tiny child, but at the same time a giant black box, right? So and that really establishes this, you know, this relationship of the respect, so that you respect the unknown and, you know, like respect this huge unknown. And I think that that's really the first point that we probably should emphasize as the theme of this webinar and as the theme of the total philosophy, which we are kind of in that sense mutually supporting, although from different backgrounds, right? So the philosophy of this utmost respect for the individual, however small, however incapacitated, however, you know, whatever. So we're always dealing with a complete individual, and that complete individual which fundamentally develops from within. And that's why all these steps, they're really so important, that we kind of take this barrier, that we don't fall into this trap. Okay, this is my child, so this is the extension of me, right? Or this child is very small, what this tiny child can possibly, you know, understand about the world, right? Or this is a child who is profoundly incapacitated, she depends on me for every kind of everyday care, from wiping her bum to feeding her, you know, and so on. So this is, in that respect, like I'm in charge, right? So that's naturally this kind of tendencies, they would sort of push through us. And that's why I believe it's really important to draw this barrier. And getting back to Amy Pickler, right? So she was Amy Pickler. So getting back to this, and you know, I'll just want to hand it back to you. So to the conversation about the introduction to the child, right? And that this introduction to a child is not something which is a one-off event. Hi, I am Diane, right? Or hi, I am Leonid, right? So it's the introduction which happens every single day, right? And the introduction happens upon every single interaction, every single act of communication, starting with the total presence, atmosphere, and so on. That's where you have to get this idea of the introduction, right? So, just back to you, Dan.
Okay, one can build on that. Maybe take some practical example of the parent.
Yeah, but maybe you can. Yeah, maybe you can get back to Pikler and what was her specifics, right? So,
Okay.
by the way, remind me, what were the age? When specifically did she practice?
Oh, hey. She was in communist times. I think before communist times, she was given the. No, don't ask me. I will look it up for the next time. But I think she died in the 60s. 70s.
Okay, so it's okay. That's it. So she died so that's the starting from the like early 20th century. Let's put it like this.
So she was a pediatrician, and she was asked to take over a child's home for the 1 year, for the 0 to 3 years old. So
you mean the orphans? The
orphanage, yeah. So she received orphans that never saw their parents or were just born and they came into the home. And she had, through her work with children and parents before that, she'd seen that the child was, as Leonie is saying, an individual and sovereign individual. Let's put it this way. The child really knows where he is, and that parents are quite good at messing it up. So she had one example. If you read some of her books, like one example was, well, what does the mom do? The mom comes with the pacifier. When the baby cries, here it is, whoop, in the mouth. So they stick the pacifier in and the child spits it out. The mom repeats this again. The child spits it out. The mom repeats it. And this goes on maybe 10 times until the child is completely pacified and accepts the pacifier. So then whenever the child cries, it needs something it maybe didn't need before. So you developed a dependence on this pacifier because you always put it there, but maybe the child just wanted to cry. Or maybe the child was hungry, or maybe the child wanted to be held, or, we don't know. So she said, go back 10 steps, just go to the child, stand there, look, talk. Are you all right? Do you need me? And try to find things out. Because then she saw the next step. Oh, the child becomes 2 or the child becomes 3. Oh, we have to get this pacifier out of the kid's mouth. He's old enough now. So then the parent takes away the pacifier and creates a kind of trauma for the child who's used to this. You created the necessity. You created the desire, the need for this pacifier, and then you take it away from the child. So these are the kind of things she observed quite astutely, I think, and try to help parents with an understanding for the child, that you have to approach a child in a different way, not put your will for this pacifier there because you don't want to hear the crying, but maybe the child really just needs a little cry, can't do much else. It might be good for him and help him to get some things out and whatever. So you could pick him up, you could walk, you could, first of all, just even look at him and ask him how things are going. Yeah, it's called a dummy, somebody is saying. In the UK, it's called a dummy. Yeah, here it's called a soot. You suck on it. So the pacifiers have all these crazy names, which actually say what they are. So she watched these things. And when they gave her the children's home, this orphanage, she said she actually tried, but she ended up firing all the old nurses because she said she could never get them to have respect for the children. They were so used to just grabbing this thing out of the bed, changing the clothes, giving it food, changing the diaper, putting him back down. But she had this vision of it's going to be like the mother. We're going to teach these nurses. So she fired them all. She hired all these young girls how to be like a mother. So when you can watch these videos online, maybe at the end, I'll share some things in the chat. They're on YouTube. You can find some things of Losi, where you see these nurses or whatever they are, the pedagogues, they come to the children. And first of all, they usually just stand there and they talk and say, hello, I'm going to pick you up. I'm going to move you. Then they move them slowly from the bed or the crib to the changing place. And you see these infants with 1 and 2 days when they say like, put the hand out. That means give me your hand. Then they start reaching their hand out when they're very small. They already understand it. They give them their hands, and she says, I'm gonna, put your clothes on. And so she's got this whole dance choreography with the children, and you see these wonderful nurses doing that. So they said, okay, when you're with the child, when you change the child, when you give the child food, when you move the child, when you do all those things, the nurses and the pedagogues, they learn you are 100% there, because that's what the child does. The child isn't thinking about what to eat for dinner or where I need to go this evening or anything else. The child is always 100% present. So that's one of the things that's in common with all these people, that they all say the small child is so intensely present in whatever he does. He's not anywhere else. He's just there. They, in Danish, it's fordybe sig. You can really dive into what you do. So you have to give the child that, which he's able to do, dive into any situation. So they had in the home, that was when you were with the child, you were 100% there. That was the nurses and everything. But then when the child was on his own, in the other times, like he's in his crib or later they're on the floor, that's when you don't mess him up. You leave him in peace. So don't go around and say, oh, are you okay? And things like that, unless they call you. Let them do what they're doing. And that's even, I think there's hundreds of hours of videos of this amazing work, what a child does. He's looking around, he starts to move, he moves his head, he's always busy. So then they were just observing how busy they were, and then seeing, well, when does the moment come when the movement gets so big it has to get out of the cot onto the floor? So then they had secure environments on the floor for the child to be moving around. And then she has these amazing videos where there's maybe 3 or 4 in a kind of enclosed area, children who can't roll, they can't talk. They can just kind of creep around to each other, but they're already communicating and trying to give each other toys or trade toys, things that like the most mothers would never notice, because you don't usually have 3 or 4 little babies on the floor at one time. So there's quite an amazing amount of research that she did, because she actually went from the observation. How are they? And in the years of the home, they didn't have any of this so-called hospitalization, where children in the orphanage, they often beat their heads on the pillows at night, or they shake their heads, and they have all sorts of psychological troubles, but their children were quite well balanced when they left the orphanage in any case. Yeah.
So I think that, Dan, this is really a great introduction, and let's rerun it like in a more systematic way, piece by piece, right? Because I think that there's a whole bunch of lessons there which we can just kind of get going if we are more attentive and really articulate it step by step. So first point, which I really wanted to highlight there, right, is that probably comes with firing of the old nurses, right? So that's really one of the important things, right? Is that this is so difficult to change the old ways, right? So if the person has been indoctrinated in one way and they morphed and shaped their own perspective of the world, especially if we talk about the professional, right? So the professional who is, and if we get back and look at that, right? So you see those nurses who were working in those facilities, probably they were good people, right? Because it's not the best paid job in the world or whatever, right? So, and they were taking care of those babies, though in a like a rather mechanical way of doing all this feeding process, diaper changing process, swaddling process and so on. But in that respect, it's being more like dealing with the machine, right? And the person who got once into this machine setting is very difficult to sort of suddenly for them to start seeing their individual, right? And one of the first things that I really want to emphasize, right, because it all sounds nice, right? And in today's And in today's world, you know, we have our fair share of people who are sort of, you know, being super soft and let the child do what they do and all this kind of stuff and so on. So it's like not that we are always facing the current psychology that is being strict, right? But I think that that is really the very important line to find, right? Is that one, when we get back to this first conversation, right? So first creating the need and then trying to take the need away, dealing with some sort of, you know, like messing the child up, right? So you see, that's probably this should be one of the first ways of like putting the question, right? So you see how not to mess the child up, right? So you see that this is really the first role, because we can't get into the position when the parent would sort of self-fire themselves, right? So but we have to get back into this and really, you know, for the parent to discover that respect and practice. I believe that that's indeed starts with long enough pauses, right? So long enough observations and readiness to enter into the situation, right? So you see that you are taking that interface, right? You're not breaking the interface, you're not kind of rushing into things and so on. You are respecting this kind of the atmosphere and the barrier around the child. I think that that is really, from a practical standpoint, this is what is most under evaluated in the whole thing. And what I really love in your example is this thing, is that when you are with the child, it's the 100% presence, but at the same time, when the child is busy with what they're busy with, you know, they have to be left alone. And you know, that's really, I think, is a big problem, because when a parent is with the child, it's often like half-hearted effort, sort of the mind is running on something else, the attention is running on something else whilst trying to pursue and fulfill some function. On the other hand, when the child is alone, the parent is never leaving it alone completely, right? So you see, it's like instead of having this clear-cut situations, this is attention, full undivided presence, full undivided attention, and respect to the child, and then, well, full undivided self-time for the parent, for the child, right? So this is really, I believe, is one of the most difficult, you know, practical things to achieve. So, and I would love to hear your further insight into this.
I think those two words, interaction and interface, are quite good, because what she's able to do, this Dr. Emmy Pickler, she's really able to make you realize how important each interaction is and how you can shape it. You can shape this kind of interface and be much more competent parent, and you can get really satisfied children. And as a parent of a special needs individual, everything gets also very difficult in this respect, but it still gives quite a important basis. I mean, one thing I could just say for even the healthy child and the special needs child is usually much more sensitive, like to full body reactions, to being shocked, to getting surprised. So the healthy child has, in the first days, they have these so-called primitive reflexes called Moro. The therapists know about them. So we all learn that Moro is part of the reflex development and so on. But if you watch the special needs children, they keep their whole life. And Lainey can describe that maybe better than I would do. But what you can really see is that Moro is extremely negative for anybody, but you don't have to let the child ever do it if you know what you're doing with your hands, and if you know how to approach a child, whether he's special needs child or whether it's a healthy individual. So if you shape that interface and your approach to the child, your way of helping him, moving him, changing him, giving him food, starting to talk, then this so-called Moro never comes at all, even in a healthy child. So one more observation I'll add before I give it to Leonid is, I've seen with healthy children that when you undress them on a what do you call it, on the changing table, in the first days of life, you take their clothes off, they go into this kind of panic, you know, even just the weight of the clothes off their body, they can't get organized with their spine and their neck. So they're even just taking their clothes off turns them into this kind of crazy, almost spastic child. These are healthy ones. And you can see it in the first 2-3 days of life, but then it kind of gets organized when the kid gets the neck organized. So now I'll give it over to you, Leonid, so you can go on with this kind of reaction and how we see it in the children and how important it is to reduce the moral for the development.
Well, you know, that's a good point. Look, you see, as we are kind of probing the waters here and establishing this this line, right? Because, you know, when we talk, it's those things are much easier to deliver when you have a like live present child in observation, right? So that you are able to observe things specifically and start paying attention to all this kind of micro movements, micro details, and the micro aspects of the situation. But well, let's try to kind of look at this thing this way, right? So first point that I really want to say is that indeed, when we are dealing with their child, you know, affected by cerebral palsy or genetic condition, right? So that means that those sort of like the levels of the first days of life, right? So the baby inside never gets really completely shielded, right? So in that respect, you know, think about it this way. So the person, if you think about their like early days of life, right? What is that? So to a great extent, it's like think of this of every child, us included, right? So think of them as an astronaut. So that, you know, the child was there happily floating in the womb, right? So you see, it was this on the being on the planet uterus, right? It's an extremely comfortable planet. The oxygen is diluted and kind of goes directly through the bloodstream. The pressure is very stable. There are no fluctuations of the reaction forces. There is nothing like that. It's a perfect planet uterus, right? And then suddenly, on one whatever unlucky day, right? So you see, well, the signal received, well, by the way, you were in a spaceship. The spaceship has arrived. Now it's time to land on Earth, right? And then the person gets landed on Earth. So landing on Earth is not easy because suddenly, you know, you have to get the air, you know, you get the oxygen out of the air. You have to exhale carbon dioxide out, get the air in. So suddenly you have to deal with all those like massive gradients of pressure. Suddenly, you know, your top and bottom are completely different. Suddenly you get the weight. Suddenly you get the reaction forces. Suddenly you get the grip to the ground. And so there's so many new things which are happening instantly. And the first of those things, right, is the necessity to breathe. And we know, like now everybody knows with this COVID thing that, you know, like 90%, 98% oxygen saturation is what is critical for, you know, life sustainability. So, and now imagine if the person during his time in the spaceship wasn't strong enough, right? So you see, they are born, meaning that they land on the planet Earth, and now they have to deliver this 98% saturation, because before it was just comfortably coming through the bloodstream without any effort, right? So that means that everything could easily be then, you know, like if you can't do this, you're not going to survive, right? So you see, the entire system gets organized around it, and everything has to sort of fall into place so that all the timings and all the sizes, proportions, and everything that has been made in this sort of in utero 3D printer. So everything has to be integrated and everything has to serve this purpose. Because if, for example, you don't have enough capacity in your like just thoracic part alone, and you need to engage additionally, I don't know, the arms need to engage additionally the abdominal wall and so on for this landing and for like making sure that your spacesuit on Earth is working. So then you are facing the troubles which you're going to carry through. So the same thing when we look at all the other features which are happening during this first days and weeks of life, you have to understand that this is that transition from the planet uterus onto the planet Earth, which is physically very, very different, and very, very difficult. So what we have with healthy people, that we somehow manage to integrate, organize, and so on, so that the baby stages, they kind of get hidden. They are, they're going into the background, and we develop the levels on top of it. But the child with the cerebral palsy, so he's, because it's a astronaut who had hard landing on Earth, so to a great extent, they still maintain this baby features all the time, right? And that's why when we talk about the development of the child with the cerebral palsy, this is the tricky part. So on the one hand, we have the the unfolding genetics and the changing proportions and so on, and the tissue properties and so on, which are happening according to the timeline. On the other hand, we have this kind of hook of which keeps us attached back to the very beginning, to the very kind of initial landing on Earth, which creates its own troubles. So, and that's why probably this is one of the most difficult things there, how you get integrated in such a way that you find this this balance, so that you are on the one hand able to address the baby inside the child, who is even like 3, 5, 20 years old, right? But there is always the baby component. But on the other hand, you are able to separate this like nourishment for that baby phase with their like adequate connection, which goes to the next levels and then next stages of development, right? So this is probably the most difficult thing that we are facing, getting back to the conversation that Diane started, that well, when the child is very small, everything kind of falls into place and everything perfectly timed together, the structure, function, and all these developments. And when this timing is off, so then we have to kind of manually address all these things, and we have to remember what would be the basics there, right? And in that sense, I believe that this is really what we want to indicate, right? Is that the first that we always have to be super attentive to this interface, right? We want to first understand what are the existent natural intentions, reactions, and the level of competence that the child has, and then kind of try to build from there. Diane?
Okay, let's go to the baby stages. They get hidden. So the baby stages, yeah, they do get hidden, but they're still actually there. So that's a really important thing to think about. Also, if we are looking more, we're going to go this time or next time, we go a bit more to ABR in general, that the approach is to, on the one hand, address those stages that the child never developed. So the normal physical therapy, let's say, of course, there's a lot of variations now. A lot of physical therapists are changing, but it has always been, let's say, the traditional, let's achieve milestones. So they had these kind of milestones, and they thought we have to just look at them. So, but between the milestones, so Pickler and these other people were saying, you know, like a milestone is something you don't even need to see because it's an accumulation of many things that are going on. It's more like the whole process, which is important, not just let's get to crawling. It's how do you get to crawling? So even Feldenkrais, he was watching, my God, what do they do there? What are they doing before they even roll there? The children are developing huge amounts of competence in how to move their trunk. So on the one hand, if we can unfold the baby stages, even in the 3 and 4 and 5-year-old or the 7 or 10-year-old, you're able to achieve huge amount of things for the child, not only in his motor development, but is in his entire psychological development. Because the trunk, for example, the baby stage is quite connected to trunk movements. That's really close to us. We're not very conscious of it, but the fact that we're not conscious of it doesn't say anything about how connected it is to us. On the one hand, the breathing is the first thing that child needs to establish, like Leonie was talking about. And this breathing mechanism, the movement of the breathing, is so extremely essential for how the child is then able to organize his trunk movements. So if the breathing mechanics is disturbed, as it is in most children with special needs, and this is talking about everything from cerebral palsy to genetic illnesses to autism or whatever, anything, you will see right away the mechanism of the breathing is disturbed. So on the one hand, you have a kind of rhythmical background movement that is disturbed and weak. And then you have the ability of the child to integrate his trunk movements and really know where he is in his trunk organization is also disturbed and weakened, as well as probably the spine getting very stiff quickly. So one of the tasks of ABR has always been to try to unfold or strengthen the spine on the one hand, the breathing, the respiration, and on the other hand, get to the spine and integrate or allow for. Before you can integrate, you have to allow for movement within this stiffened spine. So as a parent or a therapist, even if you're not a parent of a CP child, but even a therapist, seeing a lot of children, one thing to be really attentive to in babies is how can you treat these babies that they don't stiffen their spine unnecessarily through being frightened, being picked up too quickly, being shoved in any snow clothes in the winter and boots and shoved out the door, or whatever a parent could have to do in stress and haste, or a therapist. Because that has a huge effect then on the child's ability to develop his really centered baby stages and these hidden movements, or that later get hidden in the adults.
So look, I think that I'll kind of get on your point there, because you see, look, the idea for us with this much to like emphasize the ABR specifics per se, right? So you see, we have enough avenues for that, but what we are trying to get is that how we can link the other things like the everyday activities, the everyday connections and understandings, so that they would actually bring things into the right side of in the correct equation, right? So what I often try to visualize there, right, is that when we look at the development, right, so when we look at the development, we have to see it as a process. So the process where once we understood that landing on Earth, right, so you see there are like those thousands of interactions that we have on the daily basis. And when we talk about thousands, what does it mean? Thousands of interactions. That means that we have to first move into the right kind of scale. So the right kind of scale is very simple. So we have seconds, right? So 60 seconds. So 1 hour is 3,600 seconds, right? So that means that if we multiply it by 10 hours, right, that's 36,000 seconds, right? And if we kind of say, okay, let's exclude the sleep, so roughly speaking, we are dealing with 50,000 seconds per day that we are working with, right? So this is really that cloud of interactions that the child has on a daily basis, right? And then if you think about the muscle activities and the activations which are happening there, so if an average like delay in the muscle activation is quarter of a second, that means that within a second you can have like 4 actions. So 50,000 actions becomes 200,000 actions, right? So you see, that's a huge number of those actions which are happening a day. And then once you see this cloud, this sort of swarm of micro actions which are happening on the every day, now you ask yourself a question. Okay, we divide this big bulk into 2 chunks. First, one chunk is that those are the interactions that go on the good side of the development. So namely for strengthening, integrating, distributing, getting the things built up, right? So you see, basically that's the growth and differentiation. And then you've got the interactions which fall on the problematic side, right? So this side, and then there are the scales. So speaking of scoliosis, right? So scoliosis is not a disease, right? It's just an imbalance. When when you look at that, so so many things fall onto this side of the scales versus so many things falling on that side of the scale. And what is the whole big idea of us doing this, doing the communication, doing the webinars and so on, so that when we discuss any kind of therapy, ABR included, what are the realistic sort of contributions that we're able to make? 1 hour a day, 2 hours a day, whatever, right? So you see, like, but we can't go much beyond those numbers. So, but if we take things outside of the sleep perspective, there are like 16 hours of the everyday actions, and the central point is that where are they falling, right? On which side of the scales they're falling? Because if we are dealing with the actions which are feeding into those wrong processes, then it's very difficult to achieve anything with even with a good therapy, right? Because the everyday cloud of the swarm of the interactions, they keep falling onto the wrong side. And that's why we really want to emphasize this 2 big points. So one point is getting the connections and the interfaces with the channel, so doing the micro positives through all the activities related to the child, right? So in other words, whether you're feeding, whether you're changing the diaper, whether you're being with the child, whether you're holding hand or whatever, so you want to get the maximum positive value out of those interactions, so that you would make the micro feeds which will fall onto the positive side of the scales. And on the other hand side, probably at this stage even more important, is the other thing. So not to drop heavier lumps onto the wrong side of the table, of the scales. So that was the example that Diane was giving with the, for example, with the winter clothes, or when we are late to school, so we have to rush the dressing, right? So you see this kind of thing. So these are the things that we really want to highlight, and probably let's start getting more through. So what kind of these situations the family faces, and what are the costs of those kind of apparently normal things, right? So like, okay, everybody could be find themselves in the situation that they are late to school, right? So is it, but think about it, right? So you see, we find it normal, but then if you think about the atmosphere, the moment you create urgency and rush, and it's this rush comes into the atmosphere, you have to sense how much distraction you are creating to this, to the child's body. Because the moment you get tense, right, you get into the rush, that creates the atmosphere. What happens to the child? Their tone shoots up. So the moment their tone shoots up, they get more sensitive, right? So you see, as a result, getting them dressed, for example, becomes more difficult. As it becomes more difficult, you get even more frustrated, right? Because the time is ticking, the school is not going to wait, right? So you see that as you become more frustrated, as a result, you are having a tendency to do faster and more, like rough, less calibrated actions, which then translate into greater counter into greater spastic counter response of the child, so which translates into all sorts of negatives. So that's kind of the wave that everyone easily gets into it. And this is really the first point that we have to understand, that the philosophy of proper time, the philosophy of own time, that there is nothing in the outside world, with the exception of the fire or the earthquake, right? So that justifies you ruining the tempo for yourself or ruining the tempo for the child. So that's probably one of the the biggest, most important messages that I want to deliver, is that it's so important for you to find the true tempo of the child, which is actually variable tempo, the true tempo of life for the child, the true contact, the true kind of rhythm, and that dance, right? So you see, that was a good expression that you used when talking about those Pikler clinic or the Pikler orphanage nurses, right? Is that it's this dance, but the dance, it's the timing, it's the rhythm, it's the most important thing, is to find that proper rhythm of connection with the child. And that is really the central message. There's, if you step back, there is nothing external which is worth ruining this kind of relationship, right? And the thing is that, to a certain extent, when it comes to a child with the special needs, you have to throw away the clocks. That's probably the first thing, right? Is that you have to get back to life as it was in the medieval thing, right? So you see, there was the sundial approximately, and then twice a day there is a church bell, which kind of indicates that's the morning, and then there is a church bell that indicates that this is the evening. So this is like, if we want to sort of lead towards the first very practical type of thing, is that you have to pretend and like start living the life as if there are no clocks. So all the clocks have to be thrown away, because the clock, you start squeezing the child into the earth time, into the astronomical time, instead of getting life on its own time, right? So you see, like that's the life on planet uterus, right? Life on planet uterus, it was living on its own times. So when the body needed it, kind of accentuated the intake of the nutrients on whatever from the mother's body, right? So when it was no longer needed, it was evacuated there further into the bloodstream. So this is probably one of the bigger messages that I'm trying to make. And you see, look, truth to be told, it's easy for me. I mean, I am notoriously known for being late, for kind of losing the track of time, that whether it comes to being on time anywhere, right? So, or respecting the schedules or anything or something like this. So this is, for me, this is easy, right? So I'm kind of very much living like that as the person with a very limited kind of clock presence. But in that sense, I understand that this could be difficult for many parents, especially if you have other children and so on, but this is probably like one of the first skills to develop, is to like throw away, when it comes to a special child, you have to throw away all the clocks, because only once you throw away all the clocks, you throw away all of their external needs. So only then you would be able to get closer to the child, so that you're always taking it step by step. You're not looking for the completion, right? So, and like take a situation, for example, okay, we take the winter countries, right? So you see, for example, you were dressing the child, you spend 20 minutes dressing the child for getting for a walk, right? And then that child, I don't know, like she got interested in something, right? She started looking, or she started, I don't know, like looking at something like this or whatever, or just, just playing with whatever, right? You say, wow, we already spent 20 minutes with, it's time to go outside. Why we are dragging us here, right? So it's like this type of the situations that you want to really emphasize the small self actions of the child, and that you would be ready to undo and to change whatever plan you have, that you will be like having this flexibility on the one hand, that you want to get a general idea of the strategy that you want to have for a day, but then when it comes to those seconds and minutes, you have to be extremely flexible, because the moment you see something happening, some true engagement, some true interest happening from a child, you want to really nourish and like get the most out of this opportunity. Diane, so your comments on this?
Well, the comments could be that I can't tell you how many stories I've had in the last months from the so-called Corona crisis, where the parents were at home with the children, how much the children blossomed. So this is just, unfortunately, proof of the pudding that.
Well, maybe you should, you should probably bring those, at least some of those stories, because I think that it's really worth pointing this out, so that the change from the, like that's the example of that's the most recent example of at least partial removal of the clock, right?
The clock, yeah. So that when they didn't have to do the whole dressing getting in the car, getting in the taxi in Denmark, the children are often picked up in a taxi or into the car and into the institution and then back home again. So when that was all kind of eliminated, then parents were noticing speech. Amazing. I saw amazing development with speech in some children who weren't really very communicative at all, suddenly having a lot of words, a lot of even small sentences, as well as other progress. So it could be school progress, it could be speech and communication. So just showing that this kind of turning off a lot of the external things we need to do already gives the child a much huger basis for development. So here in Denmark, a lot of the parents do have the possibility to get the work compensation and stay home. Now it's getting much more difficult, but this possibility could still be there. So that creates a very special situation. And then to realize also the parents who are thinking, oh, which therapy to choose? I tell you what, the peace therapy is the best one. Peace and quiet, and also we have parents who took their children out of school because it was so difficult for them, not because of the present world situation, but because they just did it and found out the child learned so fast. He could learn everything in half an hour teaching, homeschooling a day. So these kind of lessons or these kind of things we learn from parents is really showing us a lot about the internal clock of the child and how removing stress is already a therapy. Removing stress for a CP child, for a healthy child, is therapy. And for a CP child, it's like life-saving thing to remove the stress out of the day. So even if you can't keep your child at home, because I know many people aren't able to do that, but just knowing this in the background, that less is more with these children. Peace is more than you can imagine, and everything you do has a huge value if you can do it in this kind of a relaxed, clockless, timeless mode.
Well, you see, this is really, you know, like I'll try to take it in a different way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you see, look, because we if we tend to be rational on those things, right? And it's, you know, it's, you see, some people, some parents are natural in the way that they are like relaxed, relatively phlegmatic, and non-intrusive, and so on and so on. But the reality is that when we deal with you know, the kind of distribution in the population of the parents, so what we have is that usually the parents who actually like have the strongest intent to help the child, so those are usually the parents who are more proactive, right, more intense, and so on. And for them to get this transition to be in this to get them, find themselves into the do nothing situation, could be very difficult. So, and that's why it's so important to visualize the clear things, right? So it's so important to change the lens, the scale through which you're looking at the child. And when it comes to the clock point, right, I really want to emphasize this thing, is that what is the like most fundamental thing which underpins everything in the child development. So that would be the control of the muscle tone. And when we discuss the muscle tone, so we have to remember these basics, that in the muscle tone, it's not being high or low that is essential. It's the dynamics of the muscle tone which are the key points, right? So muscle tone is not a static characteristic. Muscle tone is a dynamic characteristic. What does it mean? That means that for us, it's not that my tone is normal, right? What is important, that if I'm able to start, you know, at my starting point is a normal tone, and if I want to do a certain movement, right, I can change it from the base tone to readiness tone to some action tone, complete the movement, and that's going to be a smooth curve. Then I can hold it there, and then I can smoothly return back to the original point. So it's the rise and the relaxation, so they are very well integrated. So in that sense, you can compare it to, you know, smooth driving of a car, smooth control of the accelerator pedal, and so on. So that's what you have in the healthy person. For the child with CP, it's not this like hypertone. You know, it's not that he's stiff and spastic. It's not that he's hypotonic. Every child is dystonic. So dystonic means that you have these irregularities in the dynamic controls of the tone. So for example, instead of starting smoothly and then being able to start, imagine you're in the car. You are, you know, you've got yourself at the driver's seat, and then you got stuck. You know, you want to press the gas pedal, but you don't reach the gas pedal. So suddenly, after you getting frustrated without being able to reach the gas pedal, then suddenly your driver's seat gets off its rails and your leg bumps into the gas pedal, and suddenly the car just boom, you know, like zooms out of the garage and bangs into the wall, right? So you see, that's the sudden jump of the muscle tone, right? So then after doing a few bumps, you go, you know, that tone jumps up, stays high there, you know, you can't get your foot off the accelerator, then suddenly psh, it's off. So the tone drops immediately. So this is what we have. The child has this super irregular tone. And that's why for us, the most important thing that you can do is when it comes to this daily cloud of things, you want to add up in the types of the tonic transitions, the tone dynamics that the child that the child have. So this is the key thing, right? So you see that this tone dynamics, and that's why I'm so much against the clock, because the clock, the moment you speed up the clock, the moment you create those things, that means that you are affecting that muscle tone. You're creating the additional distortions of the muscle tone. So, and in that sense, that is probably, if we are aiming towards the practical sort of message out of this webinar, right? So you see, let's not get into the tradition of making them ultra extremely super long. So the most important thing is to keep in mind the idea of the tone control. And your best contribution is not to feed the spikes of the wrong tone, because the moment you start feeding the tone spikes, you are very much, like disturbing, destroying, and so on, all of the positive effects that you achieve through therapies and everything else. So that's really the key point. You have to visualize, as I said, visualize this daily structure like a cloud of the small events. 50,000 seconds, 200,000 muscle actions. And I'm simplifying it, right? So, and in that cloud, you want to create that distribution. So you want to, get more of the relaxed states. You get more of the states when the muscle tone travels relatively smoothly, and you want to minimize as much as possible that part of this total daily cloud where the muscle tone spikes, or when the muscle tone goes into the extreme exhaustion. So which is also going to be the spike, but into the different direction. So that is really the most important thing for you as a parent beyond the therapy, is to see the total daily picture, the total key processes. And the total key processes would be to nourish the muscle tone. Do not feed the muscle tone spikes. And, and that means that message trumps any other value. There is nothing that is valuable enough to justify those, those spikes of the muscle tone. So not the schooling, not the feeding, not the timing, not whatever, right? So you see, you want to create the atmosphere when the muscle tone is going to be the muscle tone dynamics is going to be as smooth as possible. So that's really the key point. But to appreciate it, what you want to then also to get this muscle tone in you, right? So that you will also start cooling yourself down and start looking for those interfaces and interactions with the child, so to see their true timing, to see their true phases, and to start seeing their true interests, right? So you see those true elements of when they are engaged in something, but in a non-spiky way.
Mm. So I think, I think maybe the participants can get a feeling for the foundation of what we could call ABR program or theory and so on is really to, we're giving a basis for a complete shift in your mindset. That with these children, if you want to support them and help them, you kind of have to change your glasses, change your, from everything that we've learned in our whole lives or been as parents or anything, to just start the best day one of therapy is sit down and review your day, think how it was, think how it is tomorrow, think of what things you put on your plate, whether all these things on the plate, which, we always feel, let's go to this, we're going to go to writing, we need to sensory stimulation, we need this, we need that. We get in this kind of wheel of what they call here in Denmark the hamster wheel. You have to do this, you have to do that, you have to catch up, you have to do that. But actually the basis, the real fundament, the foundation for helping these children is changing your mindset and being able to really get into an observation place, and also be confident in yourself that even observing a child is already feeding that child, that you're just sitting there watching. I can, even my healthy child, I remember until he's 16, Mom, look, he's doing something. Somehow this mom, look, is so important. Look at what I'm doing. So just look at them and see what they're doing and try to get the answers from them, also the children, about what they need. So that's already really rescheduling, restructuring your day and your interactions with the child. And then everything becomes valuable. Feeding becomes valuable. Changing the child becomes valuable. Shifting from the wheelchair to something else becomes valuable. And if it's not done in that way for these children, especially, but even for healthy children, it becomes a kind of negative for them, which Leonie was trying to describe, the negatives. Instead of being a positive, which really lifts the child up, it becomes something that kind of wipes away all your great efforts of the 2 hours of therapy in 2 seconds. So that's kind of a deep message to take with you. And we hope that you've had something out of this webinar tonight.
Yeah, and so I think that, we're just trying to find this footing for this thing. And well, I guess further on, we're going to extend this further and get this conversation more into the line of what are the sort of specifics behind it, right? So you see the specifics of the, starting from the neurology of this control and also going all the way to the, to the practical tips and tools that are coming from different parents, right? So you see how to organize the day and so on and so on. But once again, the most important thing is to understand that it's their rehabilitation life, right? So you see that the rehabilitation therapy is a small subset within the everyday rehabilitation life. So if we are able to see it this way, that you have the big cloud of the rehabilitation life, so that means that all the small interactions, they are all contributing, right? So you see, and that's what we want to do, right? We want to make them contribute into the child development throughout the rehabilitation life. And then the rehabilitation therapy time becomes like a catalyst, like an additional cherry on the cake and so on. But it's in that sense, if you don't have the cake, if the cake is always falling apart, then the cherries are not going to save it. So that is really the idea, and I hope that so please share the recording of this webinar, and we also see that there would be probably the new questions and things coming up for the next time. So, and thank you for coming. So, and well, we are going to continue in a couple of weeks, right? So with the next installation of this series. So yes.
Thanks so much for being here and taking part. Let us know if you have any questions or based on what we talked about tonight, and we'll let you know in a day or two when the next one's going to be. Thanks so much.
All right. Cheers.